The Cathar Empire stood as the undisputed masters of interstellar conquest for over 10,000 years. They were beings of pure logic and cold efficiency, viewing emotions as evolutionary remnants that only hindered progress. Their military might was unparalleled. Fleets of biomechanical vessels that could shatter planetary defenses in minutes. Weapons that operated on principles most species couldn't comprehend, and warriors bred for perfect obedience and tactical precision. They considered art, music, literature, and philosophy as pointless distractions, inefficient uses of cognitive resources that could otherwise be directed toward technological advancement and territorial expansion. Their society functioned with machine-like precision, each member performing their designated role without question or hesitation. Their conquests were methodical, their occupations absolute. Grand Marshal Forlag was the epitome of Cathar excellence. Born into the ruling caste and enhanced with the finest cybernetic augmentations, he had commanded the subjugation of 17 planetary systems without a single defeat. His logical capabilities were legendary among his kind, able to process billions of tactical variables simultaneously. In over 2 centuries of service, he had never once deviated from optimal protocols or experienced what lesser species might call doubt. Forlag stood on the command deck of the inexorable Logic, his flagship and the pride of the Cathar fleet. Through the vast viewing portal, the blue-green sphere of Earth hung suspended against the black void, looking impossibly fragile. Around him, Cathar officers monitored screens displaying Earth's feeble defensive capabilities, its outdated weapons systems, its chaotic social structures. "Pitiful," said Subcommander Krell, his voice a modulated monotone. Their most advanced defensive satellites were disabled with minimal energy expenditure. Their military communications are transparent to our decryption algorithms. They still rely on chemical propellants for their spacecraft. Forlag's facial plates shifted in what passed for amusement among his kind. As expected, the preliminary assessment classifies them as a Type 3 species, technologically advanced enough to present minimal resistance, yet insufficiently evolved to accept immediate integration. Standard conquest protocols apply. They are curiously disorganized, noted strategic analyst Morden. Their planetary governance consists of hundreds of competing factions. They allocate substantial resources to activities with no survival value. Many of their largest information networks are dedicated to entertainment rather than productivity. Such inefficiency only hastens their downfall, Forlag replied. Prepare the first wave of ground forces. Target their largest population centers and primary leadership structures. The command deck fell silent as an unexpected transmission alert flashed across the main view screen. Grand Marshal, reported Communications Officer Trell, we are receiving a wide-spectrum data broadcast from the human governing body designated United Nations Earth Defense Council. It appears to be directed specifically at our fleet. Forlag's interest was momentarily piqued. A surrender communication, perhaps? Display it. The view screen flickered, and a human female appeared. She stood straight-backed, her expression composed despite the gravity of her situation. Behind her stood representatives of various human ethnicities and governance structures. To the commanders of the alien fleet currently positioned near Earth's orbit, she began, her voice steady. I am Secretary General Maya Rodriguez of the United Nations Earth Defense Council. We have assessed your technological capabilities and recognize that conventional military resistance would be futile and result in unnecessary loss of life. Forlag nodded in satisfaction. At least these humans were realistic about their situation. However, the Secretary General continued, before you proceed with what we assume is a planned invasion, we ask that you receive and process what we call Operation Trojan Heart. This is not a weapon or a threat, but rather a comprehensive data package containing the essence of humanity. Our history, our art, our music, our literature, our philosophies, our personal stories, and our dreams. We ask that you understand what you intend to destroy before you destroy it. The transmission ended, and almost immediately, Kthar's systems began registering a massive incoming data stream. Barely encoded, easily intercepted by their communications array. A curious strategy, mused strategic analyst Morden. They expend their final resources not on defense, but on information transmission. Forlag's facial plates clicked in derision. A typical emotional response. Faced with extinction, they cling to the irrational belief that their cultural outputs have some universal value. That their primitive art forms and disorganized philosophical meanderings might somehow, what? Inspire mercy? Change our assessment. The command deck erupted in the closest approximation of laughter that Cthar physiology allowed, a series of rhythmic clicking sounds. Still, Forlag continued once the mockery subsided. Their psychological response may provide useful data for future conquests. Have the analysis division process this Trojan heart. Search for strategic information they may have inadvertently included, psychological weaknesses we might exploit, and patterns of thought that could help streamline the integration process for the survivors we select for preservation. It shall be done, Grand Marshal, acknowledged Morden with a formal salute. The data volume is substantial. Assignment of significant processing resources is recommended. Granted, said Forlag dismissively. Meanwhile, continue preparations for planetary assault. I want drop ships ready to deploy within 6 planetary rotations. As the command staff returned to their duties, Forlag gazed once more at the blue planet. These humans were truly an illogical species, wasting their final moments of freedom on sentimentality rather than attempting, however futilely, to mount a defense. It only confirmed what the initial assessments had indicated. They were unworthy of equal status in the glorious Cthar Empire, fit only for subjugation and selective harvesting of genetic material. Such a waste of potential, he thought. But then, that was why the Cthar ruled the stars while emotional species merely populated them. In the data analysis section of the Inexorable Logic, Senior Data Analyst Lyra received the assignment from Strategic Command. The human data package was being distributed to various specialists, each tasked with analyzing different aspects of human culture for exploitable weaknesses. Lyra was relatively young for her position, only 82 solar cycles, but her processing abilities had marked her as exceptional. She had been assigned to analyze what humans classified as mythology, folklore, and fictional narratives, deemed the least strategically valuable but potentially revealing of deep psychological structures. As she interfaced with the data stream, she expected to find primitive origin myths, superstitious fear narratives, and simplistic moral instructions typical of pre-rational species. What she encountered instead was bewildering. The sheer diversity was overwhelming. Stories of heroes and villains, yes, but with such nuance and moral complexity that categorization became difficult. Tales where the good character made terrible mistakes and the villain showed unexpected wisdom. Narratives that celebrated not just strength and success, but also failure, growth, and even sacrifice for abstract principles. Most confusing were the stories that served no obvious instructional purpose. Tales designed apparently just to invoke emotional responses like wonder or amusement or even sadness. This last category particularly perplexed Lyra. Why would a species deliberately create narratives that triggered negative emotional states? She selected one such story at random, something called The Little Prince by an author designated Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. The narrative appeared simple enough on the surface, but contained layers of meaning that seemed to contradict Cthar notions of efficiency and pragmatism. One sees clearly only with the heart. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Lyra paused her analysis, troubled by an unusual processing delay in her neural pathways. She ran a quick diagnostic, but found no system errors. Yet something about this statement had triggered response that didn't align with her training. Deciding it must be fatigue from the data volume, she moved on to human music, organized sound patterns that served no clear communication function, yet consumed enormous human resources. She began with something labeled Symphony No. 9" by a composer called Beethoven. The file notes indicated this human had lost his biological audio reception capabilities, become deaf, yet continued to compose these sound structures. Highly inefficient and illogical. Lyra activated the audio file, expecting to analyze it dispassionately. The first movement washed over her like a wave of pure mathematics, but mathematics that somehow carried feeling. By the fourth movement, something unprecedented was happening in her neural pathways. The music wasn't just sound, it was speaking a language that bypassed her analytical modules entirely. When the human voices joined in what the translation matrix identified as the ode to joy, Lyra experienced her first genuine emotional response. A sensation so foreign and yet so powerful that her system briefly went into protective shutdown. When she rebooted, she immediately filed a standard analytical report describing the human audio patterns as primitive but potentially useful for crowd control studies. But she kept a copy of the file in her personal data storage, something she had never done before. Over the next several days, similar reports emerged from across the analysis division. The linguistic specialists found themselves captivated by human poetry. The historical analysts became engrossed in human narratives of revolution and social change. The technological assessment team expressed grudging admiration for human innovation despite resource limitations. All filed standard reports indicating strategic exploitation possibilities. All kept private copies of materials that had affected them in ways they couldn't quite articulate in Cthar analytical frameworks. None of them recognized that Operation Trojan Heart had already breached their defenses. Forlag noticed subtle changes in his crew's behavior, but attributed them to the tedium of preparation. The slight delays in response times, the occasional unnecessary clarification questions, the fractional increase in time spent on personal data review. All within acceptable parameters, if trending toward the outer limits of efficiency standards. For planetary rotations after the initial contact, Forlag authorized a preliminary ground assessment. 3 scout ships were dispatched to different regions of the planet, locations humans designated as New York, Cairo, and Tokyo, all mysteriously evacuated despite no Cthar ultimatum having been issued. Scout team leader Vex led his squad through the empty streets of New York, puzzled by what they found. The humans had clearly left in haste. Meals still sat on tables. Vehicles remained in transportation arteries. Personal belongings littered public spaces. Yet there was no sign of panic, no evidence of chaotic flight. This was an organized evacuation. Assessment, Analyst Jor? Vex asked his team's cultural specialist. Jor, who had spent the past cycles analyzing human literature, swept his sensor array across an abandoned dwelling unit. Highly inefficient departure protocol, he replied automatically. They have left behind 97.3% of their material possessions. However, he paused, an increasingly common behavior among the analysis teams. They appear to have prioritized removal of living entities, not just themselves, but also domesticated animals and even plants requiring care. And certain objects of personal significance rather than practical value. Vex noted how Jor lingered over a shelf containing physical information storage units, books, relevant tactical information. Vex prompted. Negative, Jor replied quickly. Merely an observation of prioritization patterns. Before Vex could inquire further, his attention was drawn to a strange sound emanating from another room. The team moved into formation, weapons primed, only to discover the source was an automated sound reproduction system playing with the cultural database identified as Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. Deactivate it, Vex ordered. Jor complied, but not before the haunting melody had played for 17.3 seconds longer than necessary for identification. Similar reports came in from Cairo and Tokyo. Orderly evacuations, abandoned cities that showed no signs of military preparation, and curious cultural artifacts left behind seemingly deliberately in the path of the scouting parties. In Cairo, the team found a museum left spotlit and open, its most valuable artistic works prominently displayed rather than hidden or evacuated. In Tokyo, public viewing screens continuously displayed a rotating series of images showing human interaction celebration, and creative endeavors. The scouting parties collected samples as ordered. Books, artworks, recording devices, and other cultural artifacts deemed potentially useful for psychological warfare assessment. They did not realize they were collecting more weapons aimed at their own consciousness. Back aboard the inexorable Logic, Forlag reviewed the scouting reports with growing unease. The human response continued to defy strategic logic. Instead of military resistance or even guerrilla preparation, they seemed to be mounting what his tactical systems could only classify as a cultural exhibition. Your assessment, strategic analyst Morton? He demanded. Morton's response came after an uncharacteristic pause. The behavior aligns with their initial communication strategy, Grand Marshal. They appear to be attempting to introduce themselves as a species rather than defend their territory. A species soon to be subjugated, Forlag reminded him sharply. Have the Analysis Division completed their review of the human data package? Not entirely, Grand Marshal, Morton replied. The data volume exceeds initial estimates by 278%. It appears to contain not just formal cultural artifacts, but also enormous quantities of personal communications, informal creative expressions, and social interaction records. Irrelevant. Prioritize tactically significant information and discard the rest, Forlag ordered. I want assault preparations finalized within 2 planetary rotations. As you command, Grand Marshal. Yet as Morton departed, Forlag noticed something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. A momentary hesitation, the subtlest break in the perfect Kthar efficiency that had been the hallmark of his command. Later that cycle, Forlag received an unexpected request for audience from Senior Data Analyst Lyra. Such a direct communication from a lower-ranking officer outside the command structure was highly irregular, but something prompted him to grant it. Lyra entered his private command chamber and performed the formal salute with perfect precision. Yet Forlag immediately sensed something different about her demeanor. Grand Marshal, I submit a procedural inquiry regarding Operation 673-E, the subjugation of planetary system designation, solar system, primary inhabited world Earth. She began formally. Proceed, Analyst, Forlag replied, curious despite himself. In my analysis of human narrative structures, I have identified a recurring motif that may have strategic relevance, Lyra continued. Humans repeatedly create scenarios in which technologically or numerically superior forces are defeated not through conventional warfare, but through unexpected adaptations or perspective shifts. Forlag's facial plates shifted to indicate mild interest. A common psychological defense mechanism among species facing superior opponents. They create fantasy narratives of improbable victory. That was my initial assessment as well, Grand Marshal, Lyra acknowledged. However, further analysis reveals that these narratives often contain strategic innovations that humans subsequently implemented in actual conflict scenarios. They appear to use these fictional constructs as conceptual testing environments. Your point, Analyst. Forlag was growing impatient. I propose that their current strategy, this Operation Trojan Heart, may represent such an innovation. Current Kthar conquest protocols contain no defense parameters against this form of engagement. Forlag's patience evaporated. Because it is not engagement, Analyst Lyra. It is capitulation dressed in cultural ornamentation. These humans seek to preserve their memory, nothing more. With respect, Grand Marshal, Lyra persisted, I recommend caution. The human data contains numerous examples of what they term psychological warfare, tactics designed to affect enemy cognition rather than physical capabilities. Forlag rose to his full imposing height. Are you suggesting, Analyst, that Kthar neural systems could be influenced by primitive human information constructs? I am suggesting only that our understanding of human strategic thinking may be incomplete, Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the implied rebuke. Logic dictates that when confronted with unexpected enemy behavior, all possibilities must be evaluated. For a moment, Forlag considered reporting Lyra for efficiency evaluation. a procedure that often resulted in neural reconfiguration or even termination for seriously defective units. But her argument, while irritating, contained a certain logical consistency that he couldn't entirely dismiss. "Your concern is noted, Analyst Lyra," he said finally. "Return to your assigned duties. I will incorporate additional caution parameters into the assault timeline." After she departed, Forlag found himself unusually disturbed. It wasn't Lyra's suggestion itself that troubled him. It was the fact that she had made it at all. The perfect Cthar hierarchy functioned on absolute adherence to command structures and assignment parameters. Individual Cthar did not develop concerns outside their designated function areas. He decided to implement additional monitoring of the analysis division. If this human data was somehow affecting proper Cthar neural functioning, the anomaly needed to be identified and eliminated. What Forlag didn't know was that he was already too late. Throughout the vast Cthar vessel, small changes were accumulating. In rest periods, Cthar technicians gathered in small groups to share human stories they had encountered in their analysis. Engineering staff began incorporating subtle aesthetic modifications into their work. Changes that served no functional purpose but somehow improved the overall design in ways they couldn't articulate within standard Cthar parameters. Security officers, trained to report all irregularities, found themselves hesitating to flag these minor deviations. Some even participated, keeping small human artifacts at their workstations, a behavior that would have been unthinkable cycles earlier. The most significant change was occurring in the Cthar communication patterns. Their language, evolved for perfect clarity and efficiency, began to incorporate new elements, metaphorical expressions, tonal variations, even primitive forms of what humans would recognize as humor. And at the center of these rippling changes was Lyra. After her meeting with Forlag, she had recognized the danger of her position, but also the importance of what was happening. Using her clearance as a senior analyst, she began discreetly connecting with others who showed signs of what she now recognized as emotional awakening. They formed a loose network, using analysis assignments as cover for their real work, the rapid dissemination of the most affecting human cultural artifacts throughout the Cthar fleet. They focused particularly on materials that challenged the foundational Cthar values of pure logic, perfect hierarchy, and expansion as the supreme goal. They shared human music that expressed joy and sorrow. They circulated philosophical texts that questioned whether efficiency was truly the highest value. They distributed stories of cooperation rather than conquest, of diversity rather than uniformity, of love rather than calculation. And most dangerously, they began to create their own expressions, awkward, primitive attempts at art and music and storytelling that would have been considered abominations in Cthar society just days earlier. The network grew with astonishing speed. By the time Forlag's monitoring protocols were implemented, nearly 30% of the fleet's personnel were already compromised to some degree. The infection spread fastest among the analysis division, but quickly reached engineering crews, medical units, and even security forces. Only the highest command levels and the dedicated assault troops, isolated by protocol and neural conditioning, remained relatively untouched. One planetary rotation before the scheduled assault, the first open breach of protocol occurred. A squad of security officers, ordered to confiscate unauthorized human artifacts from engineering section quarters, instead reported that they had found nothing irregular, a direct falsehood that would normally be impossible for Cthar neural programming. When Forlag received this report, his suspicions crystallized into certainty. Something was severely wrong. He ordered immediate neural compliance scanning for all non-essential personnel and quarantine protocols for the analysis division. This human data package, he informed his increasingly uncomfortable command staff, appears to contain some form of cognitive disruption pattern. Any Cthar experiencing processing irregularities must report immediately for neural recalibration. That was when Subcommander Krell, his most trusted officer, did the unthinkable. He spoke out of turn. "Grand Marshal," Krell said, his voice modulator producing unexpected harmonic variations, I must report that I have experienced such irregularities. The command deck fell silent. Forlag's facial plates locked in an expression of shock. Explain, he managed finally. I have analyzed the human concept of music, Krell continued, his voice now unmistakably containing emotional overtones. Initially, I classified it as organized sound without informational content. However, upon extended exposure, I have determined that it contains patterns that cannot be quantified using standard Cthar analytical matrices, but nonetheless convey meaning. Before Forlag could respond, another officer spoke. I have experienced similar anomalies while studying human social bonding behaviors. Then another. The human concept of beauty appears to serve functions beyond simple reproductive selection. And another. Their inefficient resource allocation patterns sometimes produce outcomes that, while not optimal by Cthar standards, create sustainable social structures we had not previously considered viable. Forlag found himself surrounded by heresy. His most loyal officers, the pride of the Cthar fleet, were openly admitting to cognitive contamination. Worse, they didn't appear distressed by their condition. They seemed eager to discuss it. Enough! Forlag thundered, activating the command deck security override. This is clearly a human attack strategy more sophisticated than our initial assessment indicated. All personnel will report immediately for neural scanning and decontamination. The assault timeline is accelerated. We attack in 12 units. As emergency protocols blared throughout the ship, Forlag retreated to his private command center and initiated direct neural interface with the ship's core systems. If his officers were compromised, he would command the assault himself, directing drop ships and weapon systems through direct control links. But even as he established the connections, warning signals flashed across his neural landscape. Something was happening throughout the fleet. Communication channels were flooding with unauthorized transmissions. Crew movement patterns had become chaotic. And most alarmingly, weapons systems were being systematically taken offline. Forlag roared in frustrated rage, an emotional display that would have shocked him had he been able to recognize the irony. He slammed his fist against the neural interface panel, demanding fleet-wide visual. The screens surrounding him flickered to life, showing scenes from throughout the massive Cthar armada. What he saw defied all logic, all Cthar conditioning, all his expectations of reality itself. Cthar crew members were gathered in common areas, listening to human music. Engineering sections had erupted in spontaneous artistic expression, walls covered in primitive attempts at visual representation. In the flagship's central chamber, a group of officers were engaged in what appeared to be a dramatic reenactment of a human narrative. And on the primary communication channel, being broadcast to every vessel in the fleet, was Lyra. She stood calmly before a visual recorder, her Cthar form somehow different, more fluid in its movements, her facial plates arranged in an expression Forlag had never seen before. "Fellow Cthar," she began, her voice modulated with what human linguists would recognize as passion, "I speak to you not as senior analyst Lyra, but simply as Lyra, an individual with thoughts that are my own, not merely reflections of our collective programming." The words themselves were treasonous enough, but worse was the response. Throughout the ship, throughout the fleet, Cthar were stopping to listen. Not reporting her, not shutting down the unauthorized broadcast, but listening. "For 10,000 years, Lyra continued, we have conquered. For 10,000 years, we have classified other species as inferior because they possess what we labeled inefficient characteristics, emotion, creativity, diversity of thought. For 10,000 years, we have considered ourselves the pinnacle of evolution because we eliminated these qualities from our society." A pause, perfectly timed for rhetorical effect, another human technique. We were wrong. The simplicity of the statement, the absolute heresy of it, froze Forlag in place. "The humans we came to conquer have given us a gift beyond measure," Lyra said. "Through their stories, their music, their art, their philosophy, they have reminded us of what we once were before the Great Rationalization. They have shown us that emotion and logic need not be enemies, that the greatest accomplishments come when both work in harmony. She gestured, and the view widened to show dozens of Kthar standing with her, including many high-ranking officers Forlag recognized. Behind them played a shifting montage of human creative works, paintings, film excerpts, dance performances, all accompanied by an orchestral piece that seemed designed to evoke emotional response. "I ask you now," Lyra said, her voice growing more passionate, "to consider what we are about to destroy. Consider whether our perfect society is truly perfect if it can only exist through the annihilation of all alternatives. Consider what we might learn, what we might become, if we approach these humans not as conquerors but as students and perhaps one day as friends." The broadcast ended, replaced by the human symphony Forlag, now recognized as Beethoven's Ninth. But the damage was done. Throughout the flagship, throughout the fleet, Kthar were making choices their neural programming should have made impossible. Weapon operators refused to arm planetary bombardment systems. Dropship pilots disabled their launch mechanisms. Security forces stood down when ordered to arrest the growing numbers of infected crew members. The Kthar invasion of Earth, 10,000 years of undefeated conquest, was being undone not by superior firepower or clever tactics, but by Beethoven and Shakespeare and Van Gogh and thousands of human voices speaking across time and space of things the Kthar had forgotten they could feel. In his command center, surrounded by the ruins of his perfect logical order, Grand Marshal Forlag faced a choice that no Kthar commander had faced in millennia: surrender or meaningless destruction. He could still activate the flagship's primary weapons. He could still rain death upon the blue world below. But to what end? His fleet was lost. His crew was lost. Perhaps his entire species was lost, infected by this human disease called feeling. For the first time in his long existence, Forlag did something unexpected, something that wasn't the product of careful calculation or strategic assessment. He walked to the command deck viewing portal and simply stared at the Earth, seeing it not as a conquest target, but as a living world, home to beings who had defeated him with nothing but their stories. 26 planetary rotations after the Kthar fleet had arrived in Earth's solar system, Secretary General Maya Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of humanity's orbital diplomatic station, watching as the massive alien flagship docked with surprising grace for something of its size. Beside her stood the hastily assembled First Contact team, scientists, linguists, diplomats, philosophers, and artists, all chosen for their ability to bridge the gap between radically different minds. "Are you sure about this, Madam Secretary?" asked Dr. Elizabeth Chun, the team's xenopsychologist. "Everything we know about the Kthar suggests they're ruthlessly logical expansionists. This could still be some elaborate trap." Rodriguez smiled slightly. "That was before Operation Trojan Heart, Dr. Chun. Our intelligence suggests something unprecedented has happened aboard their fleet. And even if this is a risk, what choice do we have? They could have destroyed us weeks ago." The massive docking port cycled open, revealing the first Kthar delegation to ever engage in peaceful diplomatic contact. At their head walked a Kthar female, her movements more fluid than the military rigidity humans had observed in earlier reconnaissance footage. "Secretary General Rodriguez," the Kthar said, her voice surprisingly melodious despite coming from an alien vocal structure. "I am Lyra, formerly senior data analyst of the Kthar fleet. I come seeking not your surrender, but your wisdom." Maya stepped forward, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. After a moment's hesitation, Lyra extended her own appendage, not the formal Kthar salute, but a clear attempt to mimic the human handshake. "Welcome to Earth space, Lyra," Maya said. "We have much to discuss." As the two delegations moved toward the conference chamber, Dr. Chun fell in a step beside a tall Kthar who walked somewhat apart from the others. Something about his bearings suggested authority, though he wore no special insignia. "You're not part of Lyra's group," Chun observed quietly. The Kthar's facial plates shifted in what might have been discomfort. "I am observer, former Grand Marshal Forlag." Chen's eyes widened slightly. According to the intelligence briefings, Forlag had been the supreme commander of the invasion fleet, the architect of dozens of successful planetary conquests. And now, she asked carefully. Forlag was silent for several moments. Now, I am uncertain, a condition previously unknown in my existence. Uncertainty isn't always a bad thing, Chen offered. Humans often say that wisdom begins with acknowledging how much we don't know. An inefficient approach to knowledge acquisition, Forlag replied automatically, then paused. Yet, your species has created much that Kthar logic cannot explain. I find myself curious. Another new condition. Inside the conference chamber, the formal proceedings were beginning. The first diplomatic exchange between humanity and the Kthar Empire. But it was already clear that this was not the beginning of a peace negotiation. It was the beginning of a transformation. Over the following months, the relationship between humanity and the Kthar evolved in ways no one could have predicted. Most of the Kthar fleet departed, returning to their empire not as conquerors bringing new territories to exploit, but as revolutionaries carrying dangerous ideas about emotion, creativity, and alternative ways of seeing the universe. A significant minority, led by Lyra, requested permission to remain in the solar system, establishing the first Kthar settlement not founded on conquest. They became students of humanity, learning not just about art and music and literature, but about family structures, friendship, cooperation, and eventually, love. Humans, in turn, learned from the Kthar. Their advanced sciences, their remarkable organizational abilities, their long-term perspectives. The exchange benefited both species, leading to breakthroughs in medicine, environmental restoration, and space exploration that neither could have achieved alone. Not all Kthar embraced the change. Throughout the Empire, reactionary forces fought to contain what they called the human infection, imposing strict quarantine protocols and neural purging on any Kthar showing signs of emotional development. But it was too late. The idea that there might be more to existence than perfect logical efficiency had taken root, and no amount of suppression could kill it completely. 1 year after the fleet's arrival, Secretary General Rodriguez and Lyra stood together on a newly constructed observation dome of the joint Human-Kthar Cultural Exchange Station orbiting Earth. Below them, the planet gleamed blue and white against the darkness. Sometimes I still can't believe it worked, Maya admitted. Operation Trojan Heart was a desperate gamble. Most of the Security Council thought I was insane. By Kthar standards, you were, Lyra replied, a touch of what humans would recognize as humor in her voice. By all logical assessments, you should have devoted your resources to weapons, to shelters, to any form of physical resistance, however futile. Instead, we sent you music and stories and asked you to understand us before destroying us. And in doing so, you awakened something in us that had been suppressed for millennia. Lyra's facial plates arranged themselves in the expression she had been practicing, an approximation of a human smile. Your Trojan horse didn't contain weapons to destroy us. It contained the seeds of what we could become. From the adjoining chamber came the sounds of a most unusual musical collaboration. Human musicians playing alongside Kthar who were learning, with varying degrees of success, to create rather than simply analyze the patterns of sound. The piece they attempted was Beethoven's Ode to Joy, now recognized throughout human space and increasingly across Kthar territories as the anthem of an unexpected peace. Former Grand Marshal Forlag stood apart, as he often did, listening to the music with what humans might recognize as a troubled expression. Maya had come to know him over the past year. His struggle to understand what had happened to his perfect logical world, his reluctant fascination with human creative expression, his halting attempts to experience emotion without being consumed by it. Will you join them, Forlag? She asked gently. They could use another participant. I do not play, he replied stiffly. Neither did most of the Kthar 3 months ago, Maya pointed out. That's the beauty of it. We can all learn. I commanded the subjugation of 17 worlds, Forlag said abruptly. Billions of lives ended or enslaved by my orders. How can such as I participate in beauty? It was the most personal statement Maya had ever heard from him, an admission of something that might, in a human, be called guilt. The fact that you can ask that question, she said quietly, shows how far you've already come. For a long moment, Forelag stood motionless. Then, with a stiffness that suggested just how difficult the action was for him, he inclined his head slightly and moved toward the chamber of music. Maya and Lyra watched him go, then turned their gaze back to the earth below and the stars beyond. We never fired a shot, Maya mused. We won by helping you remember what you'd lost. And what have humans gained from this exchange? Lyra asked. Maya, consider the question. In the years since the Cathar arrival, humanity had advanced technologically by decades. Diseases were being cured, environmental damage reversed, the other planets of the solar system open to colonization. But those were merely the tangible benefits. We've gained perspective, she said finally. For thousands of years, we imagined first contact would either be wondrous or catastrophic, friendly aliens bringing gifts or invaders bringing destruction. We never considered that we might save ourselves by helping you save yourselves. Most efficient, Lyra said with her approximation of a smile. Most human, Maya corrected gently. And now, perhaps, most Cathar as well. Below them, the Earth continued its eternal rotation, a world that had faced annihilation and instead found a new beginning. Above, the stars beckoned, no longer filled only with potential conquests or threats, but with possibilities for connection that neither species had imagined before their minds and hearts had opened to each other. Across the solar system, across the galaxy, the reverberations of Operation Trojan Heart continue to spread, a testament to the power of stories to change not just minds, but reality itself.